Thanks very much, Alex. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. My name is Andy Staples. I'm the founder and principal of Geopol Asia, a geopolitical advisory firm, and also delighted to be part of the advisory board here at the Hinrich Foundation. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to welcome Michael to this session today. And I'm just going to read through his bio before we get into the book itself, the themes that are raised by Michael. Michael will be talking for about 25, 30 minutes or so, and then we'll get into a discussion with all of you. Of course, we have people online as well, and I would urge people online to send through any questions that you might have. I'll get them here on my phone, and we'll bring them into the conversation. Michael Pembroke is a writer, historian, and avid naturalist whose work spans law, global affairs, and environmental history. Born in Sydney in 1955, he's educated at the University of Sydney and the University of Cambridge, and later served as a director's visitor at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. Michael has contributed to Time Magazine, Al Jazeera, South China Morning Post, and major Australian news publications, bringing historical depth and narrative clarity to contemporary geopolitical and cultural issues. He served as a judge at the Supreme Court of New South Wales from 2010 to 2020, and currently chairs, Red Room Poetry, one of Australia's leading literary organisations. He's also the author of 5 books, and I won't go through them now because we're going to be going through the latest book in quite some detail in a moment. We'll also be drawing your attention to another of Michael's publications shortly. With that, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. I had the pleasure of reading your text over the Christmas holidays, and you see it's quite well annotated here. I'm well prepared to grill you on all the themes and issues that you've raised. But before I do all that, over to you, and please take us through your book, the key themes that you've identified, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion.
Well, thank you, Andy, and welcome to the students. And it's a great honour to have Merle Hinrich here too. I'm very pleased to see him and to meet him this afternoon. I must say, before I go on, the photograph that you see on the screen is about 17 years old. And I'm now, I think, the second oldest person in the room after Merle, and I've reached the grand age of 70, so I'm a little embarrassed by that photograph. It was taken before my very first book, 5 books ago. Now, what I thought I'd do in my allotted time is give you a little potted summary of the major themes and parallels in the book. And I thought that I'd deal with some introductory remarks first, then tell you about the commodities, the silk, the porcelain, the tea, and the silver and the opium, which were paid for in exchange. And then I thought I'd deal with the invasions which the trade eventually led to. The invasions which started with the first Opium War in 1839. But let me give you an outline of some introductory remarks. Firstly, for most of the last 2,000 years, China, and to some extent India, has been the dominant economic force in the world. My book covers only the imperial period, that is from the first emperor at Qin in 221 BCE to the last emperor, the boy Puyi, in 1912. In that period, that imperial period, not only was China probably the major dominant economic force in the world, but by 1820, as recently as that, it had the largest GDP in the world. And for the 300 years, from the early 1500s, when Europeans, led by the Portuguese, first started to come to China, to Canton, China was effectively the sole global manufacturing superpower. One historian described it as the cog running the wheel of global commerce. It was also the universal destination for most of the world's silver. China wanted silver in exchange for its export products, and everyone brought their silver to China, where its value was worth more because the demand was so great. Compare that to the current day, where China is again the global manufacturing superpower. And it has a trade surplus every year of about $1 trillion or $100 billion every month. At the end of World War II, the United States was the global manufacturing superpower. It lost that mantle some time ago. At the end of World War II, it was also the largest creditor nation in the world. China is now the largest creditor nation in the world. The United States is now the largest debtor nation. Don't take this personally, by the way. So the dominance of China in the trade, the export trade, in years past, led to friction. Now, I hope, and it's leading to friction now, not military friction, and I hope it doesn't become so. One of the byproducts of the dominance of China's trade was the balance of trade, the outflow of silver from European countries to pay for the export products from China. That was a worry as early as the early Romans. In the time of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and in the first century AD, the elder statesmen of Rome worried and complained about the ladies of Rome spending so much money, as they did because they were extremely affluent, on exotic products from the East, particularly silver, just so they could shimmer in public, as they said. The result was that over time, Rome's gold and silver resources became depleted. And as you probably know, by about the 3rd century of the modern era, the debasement of Rome's currency and the cost of its military and its foreign bases contributed to its own collapse. In the 18th century, the problem became very acute to European nations as well. So in the middle of the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume said that if China were as close to us as France or Spain, everything we use would come from China. And a very important man, Sir Isaac Newton, said a little earlier, and at that time he was Master of the Royal Mint, in charge of the Exchequer. He said the China trade is so huge, it takes away all the silver of Europe. And one other was Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish intellectual, very important figure in botany. And he sounded like some modern Trumpians because he said, there is nothing more important than to shut that gate to China through which all the world's silver goes. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. Let me tell you about the commodities. There are 5 that I deal with in the book. Silk came first. It went to Rome, as I said, at the time of the first Roman emperor. Porcelain came next at the time of the Portuguese arrival in China, and tea shortly after. So silk, porcelain, and tea are the 3 primary products. And in Europe, there was a complete fad for all of those products. More than a fad, they became must-have products. Silver was used to pay for those products, as I said, and then opium was used in the 19th century from about the 1820s onwards, and I'll explain a little later how that came to be. It was a rather cynical move by the British at that time. One of the reasons for these products becoming such a sensation was that they were totally unknown to Europeans. So when silk first made its way from the periphery of the Roman Empire around the Euphrates River, the first people to see it were the Roman legionnaires, and they'd never seen anything like it whatsoever. And when it got to Rome, the citizens of Rome, as I said, extremely wealthy in those days, extremely affluent, went head over heels for silk because they were used to wool and linen. Nothing like silk, no fabric like silk was known to Europeans. Cotton hadn't arrived. When Julius Caesar first became aware of silk in about 46 BCE, he replaced the large awnings in the Roman Forum, which were normally linen and a drab sort of off-white color, with colored silk. And the Roman citizens could not believe their eyes. It was more fabulous, more unbelievable to them than the show of gladiators that followed. At that time, Cleopatra was Julius Caesar's mistress. She later became Mark Antony's wife. And she appreciated the benefits and the beauty of silk, and she led the fashion. Ladies and men too follow that fashion. One emperor wore nothing but silk. Nothing but silk. And of course, the secret of making silk, like the secret of making porcelain and the secret of making tea, were totally unknown to the Europeans. They scratched their heads for nearly 6 centuries before, through a very clever piece of industrial espionage, the secret of making silk was smuggled out of China by several Nestorian monks in the time of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. That's a legend. We can't prove it definitively, but it's commonly accepted. So once the secret was out, then silk spread. The sericulture, as silk making is known, became very well established in northern Italy and Spain. Italy has often led the way in the trade with China. As we saw at the time of COVID, by the way, because those flights from Wuhan were going straight into northern Italy, and northern Italy was where the European COVID first erupted. So that's silk. Porcelain was first noted by Marco Polo. Marco Polo went to China in the period between about the 1270s and the early 1290s. It was during the time of the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty. Marco Polo wrote when he saw porcelain that nothing lovelier could be imagined, because Europeans were used to earthenware and pewter, and perhaps silver or gold if you were royalty. Porcelain was something else. It was finer, harder, translucent, could be translucent, hard as flint, and beautifully produced and painted. For the next 400 or 500 years, Europeans scratched their heads about how to create porcelain. Kings and princes employed alchemists to try and discover the secret. It took until 1708. A German man, a young man called Johann Böttger, was virtually kidnapped by the King of Poland, placed in effectively a dungeon, and eventually near Dresden, at a place called Meissen, which is now a famous porcelain factory area. He cracked the code through trial and error. And from there, porcelain spread throughout Europe. It had become so popular that the Dutch Republic, or the Dutch Empire, was bringing in tens of millions of pieces of porcelain every year. Dutch ships would leave Canton loaded with porcelain, plus other things like silk and precious goods. And very often they were raided by pirates, and including English pirates. Porcelain spread. The French, who are famous for their porcelain, did not get going until 1768, more than 50 years after Meissen. They established a porcelain factory at Sèvres in the Loire Valley. The English also started porcelain manufacturing in that same year, 1768, and the first piece of English porcelain was a fairly drab beer tankard, but that was the beginning of the process. And Wedgwood took over the first porcelain manufacturing company. Tea was incredible. In Shakespeare's time, say 1600, when he was at his peak, no one in England knew what tea was. Shakespeare never mentioned tea. He mentioned mead and claret and beer and ale and things like that. Tea was unknown. No one in England drank a hot decoction just for pleasure. There were some medicines, but you didn't drink hot things. So tea started to filter through. The Portuguese were the first, then the Dutch. But it took off in England when the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza came to England to marry Charles II in the Restoration, 1662, I think it was. And she brought with her a dowry. The dowry consisted of many chests of tea and chests of porcelain. And she established in the royal court a practice, a habit of the ladies sitting with her and drinking tea from fine porcelain. And what happened in the royal court was emulated and filtered down to other people, to the point where tea became England's national drink rather quickly. At first it was too expensive, but it was democratized and became more affordable. So after a while, there was tea in every household in England. But more importantly, the taxes and duties on the import of tea into England were a critical factor in sustaining the British Treasury. 10% of all revenue came from tea in the early 1800s. The tea trade became more important than the trade in any other product. And it became a sort of a national emblem and led to war, as I'll come to in a moment. The silver, first of all, the British brought it in their ships. They brought ships out from England with chests of silver and went back with chests of silk and porcelain and other products. After a while, the Spanish discovered silver in mines they established in Peru and what's now Bolivia. The biggest mine of all time at that period was the Potosi mine. And shortly after the silver was discovered at Potosi, the silver was initially taken up to the Panama Canal, or where the Panama Canal is now, taken overland to the port to Portobello, and then shipped in treasure ships across the Atlantic to Cadiz, and then up to Seville and onwards to Amsterdam and London. But in the 1570s, the Spanish discovered the Trans-Pacific route. They'd already gone across to the west to Asia, but it took them a long time to work out how to get back. And that wasn't straightforward. You actually had to go up towards Japan and do a sort of circuit around the very north of the Pacific Ocean and come down the North American west coast. But once they did that, the Manila galleon trade began. Manila galleons were named because the ships were built in Manila, a Spanish colony, which they established in 1571. The ships brought goods from China to Acapulco on the Mexican coast, where there was a trade fair every year, which was the biggest trade fair in the world at the time. The galleons would load up with silver in Acapulco and make their way across to Manila. Those ships were like floating bank vaults. They carried so much silver, often overloaded, especially when they came back with goods from Manila. The goods from China and the East were taken from Acapulco up to Mexico City, which became effectively the center of the world between West and East, where the West met the East. Mexico City in those days, in the 1600s, was wealthy beyond imagination. And then the products would go down to the Portobello and the other Caribbean ports, where they would go back to Europe. Now, I've mentioned how the drain on silver became a huge problem. So in the late 1800s, late 18th century, the late 1700s, the East India Company, in conjunction with Warren Hastings, the governor of Bengal, devised a scheme. What they did was they created the largest opium-producing territory in the world along an 800-kilometre stretch of the lower Ganges River. They produced opium. They created huge factories there. The most well-known were at Patna and Benares, and those names became brand names like Marlboro or Benson and Hedges or other cigarette brands of the next century. They sold the opium at auction in Calcutta, and this was what they thought was their system of plausible deniability, because they sold the auction to independent traders. But they knew the independent traders would then smuggle the opium to China. They would then use the opium in exchange for silver when they got to China, and they would also use it to buy tea from the East India Company. And so the process reversed the flow of silver. It reversed the flow from outwards from Europe to outwards from China. And it was all sustained by the financial networks in London, because if you know what a bill of exchange is, the smugglers and the traders would deposit their silver in the East India Company's treasury in Canton, receive bills of exchange drawn on London banks, discounted through brokers, and traded around the world, because it was a lot more convenient to have bills of exchange. And those bills of exchange would then be discounted and traded for other trade around the world, including buying cotton from the United States. So the system was propped up by a whole series of financial organizations in London, which could not afford to be without the opium trade, which is one of the reasons why it took so long to stop that trade. It was not until at least 1905 despite years and years of pressure and complaint, that the British Parliament resolved to stop the trade. And then they only decided that they would reduce it by 10% a year for 10 years. It had to be gradual. There couldn't be any shock to the system. Well, the last section, and I'll deal with this briefly, it's possibly the worst, the most horrific, is the period of the invasions. Because China sought to stop the opium trade. You might have heard of Commissioner Lin. There's a statue of him in New York, another one in Taiwan. Lin Jeju. He was appointed by the emperor to stop the trade in Canton. He confiscated the opium belonging to all the European traders. They couldn't, and he said, first of all, he gave them a deadline. He said, hand it over in the next little period, and if you don't, I'll take it. They couldn't believe him. They ignored his deadline. The opium was confiscated, and the British government was up in arms. It sent an invasion force at the end of 1839, 1840. The purpose of that invasion force was to protect the opium trade. They weren't going to have the Chinese emperor stopping their trade in opium. The war that followed was one-sided. China did not have an adequate force to defend against British warships and British troops. But it lasted from 1839 till 1842 when there was a treaty. That treaty, the Treaty of Nanjing, was the first of the unequal treaties. And as a result, 5 treaty ports were open to European trade. Until that point in time, only Canton was opened. Well, that war was followed by the Second Opium War because the British weren't satisfied with the extent to which the Chinese had adhered to the Treaty of Tianjin, and they wanted more treaty ports. The Second Opium War started in 1857 and culminated in 1860 with the sacking and burning of the Old Summer Palace in Beijing. The British and the French forces together looted the Old Summer Palace, but only the British decided that they should sack it and burn it so that it was gone forever. The French would not participate. They said that the British plan was a Goth-like act of barbarism. The next series of invasions were in the 1870s and 1880s. These were smaller. Russia took a little bit of Xinjiang in the west. France invaded the south coast around Fujian, Fuzhou. And Japan toyed with Taiwan and then took Okinawa and the islands where Okinawa is. Then the very worst invasion, well, maybe not the worst, but a very, very serious invasion was in 1895. It was the first war that Japan launched against China. And then the culmination of all of these wars was the invasion force that arrived in 1900. You've probably all heard of the Boxer uprising. The Boxers were ordinary, usually poor young men, mostly from Shandong province, who protested against the missionaries and the Europeans. And their methods were brutal. They killed many. The European forces, just a bit like modern days, brought together a coalition of the willing. It was actually all the same G7 nations that we hear of today, with the addition of Imperial Russia. Britain, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, they all came along in a joint force. And their job was to put down the Boxer uprising, but then for the next year or so, they engaged in their own reprisals, which were probably as brutal as the killings by the Boxers themselves. So that's where we get to the end of the story. I should add one more thing. At the end of the First Opium War, at the end of the Second Opium War, at the end of the Japanese War, and at the end of the Boxer uprising, indemnities were extracted from China, and they got bigger and bigger every time, to the point where the indemnity, the Boxer indemnity as it was called, was so huge that it bankrupted China and crippled it. And it did exactly what the indemnity imposed on Germany did in 1919 at Versailles. It guaranteed that there would be a breakdown in society and another war. And almost the same countries extracted that indemnity from Germany in Versailles in 1919. So I don't know if I've kept to time. I haven't seen any signals, but that's a bit of a survey of what the book covers. I've been addressing the students, and I've been looking to my left deliberately. I hope you don't feel left out on the right-hand side.
Michael, thank you so much for taking us through that arc of the book. It's an absolutely fascinating read. Many of the stories I've read from different perspectives over the years, the Opium Wars, the trade in silver, silk, porcelain, more contemporary history, and so on. But this is the first time to have it all weaved together in such a compelling narrative. I'm going to take the advantage of being moderator and pose a few questions to you to dig into some of the themes. I'll be coming to the audience, so please do have questions, comments that you'd like to pose to Michael. Please do marshal your thoughts, and that goes to people online as well. I can see a couple of questions already coming through. There's so much there that I'd like to dig into. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do all of that, so I'm going to try and focus on the issues that I think are most important for me. First of all, the book is fantastically written, but there's a sense of sort of tragedy, I think, that runs through it, and particularly that the last section that you were talking about, the collapse of China, the imperialism, and I'm sitting here as a Brit, a tea-drinking Brit, and the shameful sort of imperialism that we saw in those years, and how that set up this century. China refers to the century of humiliation, the unequal treaties, and so on. So I'm very interested in history. I'm particularly interested in the history that you've described there and the relevance of all of that today, how that underpins international relations today, not least between China and the United States. But I'll just leave that there as a thought that particularly interested me. Well, one thing to go back to, thinking about globalization, we hear a lot that globalization has reached its peak, that we're in a state of deglobalization, whatever it might be. But most people think of globalization in very recent terms, of container ships. And an economic growth, but you go back to the 1600s, and you just described there that emergence of a global economy based on trade with China and silk. I wonder if I could ask you to dig into that today. I think you describe it as the beginning of globalization, the first emerging world economy. I get a bit more on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, once the Spanish discovered the trans-Pacific route, shipping was able to go around the world. And apart from the Navy, the purpose of ships was to trade. So from the late 1500s through the 1600s, we had the first wave of global trade. It was the Spanish going across to Manila and trading with the Chinese coming across from the East Coast. And we had trade coming from Northern Europe around to the South Atlantic, below the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, usually through the Malacca Strait. They'd often go, very often would they go to India and Sri Lanka, Penang, down the Malacca Strait, and then up through the South China Sea to Canton. So there was a well-established trading route which circumnavigated the world. And along that route went silver in one direction to China, and the export products that Europe demanded in the other direction. Or in both directions, actually, because some products went west following the Cape of Good Hope and Atlantic route, and some went across the Pacific, eventually to Cadiz and Seville and through to Europe.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of other things before I come to the audience. Reading the sections on porcelain was fascinating. A very evocative description of the manufacture, the mass manufacture of porcelain hundreds of years ago. Sort of, it brings to mind to me, again, for the UK, you think of the Industrial Revolution. You think about the dark satanic mills in northern Europe, that's steel and pottery and Wedgwood you mentioned and so on. Yeah. But this was taking place hundreds of years before in China. That to me was quite fascinating, that you had this very sophisticated economy in China producing things that nobody else was aware of how to manufacture.
Yeah. Well, there's a city in China called Jingdezhen, and it was the world center of porcelain manufacturing going back for centuries and centuries. In fact, there were so many smokestacks in Jingdezhen that it was like the Stoke-on-Trent, the mills in England in the 19th century. But and it was so busy. There were so many places where different aspects of the porcelain manufacturing trade were carried out, and the Chinese had worked out through trial and error over many, many centuries that the best way to do it was through many hands doing small tasks to make up the overall whole. So there were people who tended the furnaces, people who watched the objects in the furnaces, people who had to moderate the heat, people who had to deal with the product when it came out, some who had to paint one tree or one part of a tree, others who had to paint another part of the tree or a bridge, or all those patterns that appear on Chinese porcelain. And so hundreds and hundreds of people were involved in the process of making one teacup. And that was a form of industrialization before we had steam engines.
And this preempts Adam Smith.
Yes.
The classic example of specialization, of making pins and so on by many years. One final question for me, if I may. So maybe a bigger one. The subtitle of the book is "The Trade with China That Changed History," and it seems to me that there was an inflection point at somewhere. You mentioned that China's economy was the world's biggest right up until the early 1800s. When the opium trade was really sort of kicking into gear and so on. At some point, power flipped from China, the world's biggest, most sophisticated economy. It bled out of China elsewhere to Britain, in particular, Western powers more broadly. I would say, is that fair? That you would point to sort of that period, early 1800s, as that fundamental shift within the global political economy?
Yes, I thought I'd made that clear. I think by the 1820s, when China had the world's largest GDP, the introduction of opium on a large scale, huge scale, completely changed the trade, resulted in the efforts by the emperor to shut down the opium trade, and consequently led to the attempt by the British and the French and the Western powers to allow the expansion of the trade, the opening of treaty ports, and the reduction of China to the state of neo-colonialism. And the result was, and the influence, the effect on the present is this: the father of the republic, the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912. The father of the republic was Sun Yat-sen. What he wanted to do after so many decades, almost a century, of neo-colonialism was to get back China's sovereignty, establish its independence, and to unify it. Now, they were the same principles that Mao sought to introduce when he came to power in 1949, and they're very much the same principles that Xi Jinping has tried to build on. And both Mao and Xi Jinping espouse Sun Yat-sen as being a great hero for the Chinese nation. So that the result for modern observers is that China is absolutely determined to ensure its sovereignty is not intruded upon, that it is allowed to pursue its own people's prosperity without interference, and that it retains a strong central government and will never again allow itself to be broken up in the way it was after the century of humiliation.
Yeah. And I think this is why the book is so valuable, particularly to students of business today, of globalization, to understand the dynamics that shape contemporary China and our global economy. Okay. I'm going to stop asking questions. I could be here all night, and that's unfair of me. So let me come to the audience and see if we have some questions. We have some hands coming up over here. Let me start here, and just let us know who you are, and try to keep the questions short and sweet so we can get through as many as we can.
Hello, my name's Mark Wales. I'm an author whose second book is actually, this forms part of the story. I'm interested in your views of the economic impact on India of the opium trade on, while the farming, etc., was under quite onerous contracts, etc., and the factories were possibly some of the worst the world has ever seen. What was the impact economically at India at that time, or did everything just bleed out to Britain?
Well, the answer is, and I'm not an Indian historian, by the way, but I don't. The opium production areas and the factories at Patna and Benares were like slave labor. They were really dreadful places. The growers of opium were paid a pittance, and much of their product was often rejected, and they had to. They were effectively bound to the East India Company. And many of them died in the process of making opium. They were exposed to the fumes of liquid opium as they stirred it and the like, which I've all described. But I don't know if India got anything out of it, because all of them profit from the opium trade went to the East India Company and indirectly to the British government. And all the opium trade did to the Indians was to impoverish them. And India, of course, was effectively under the control of the East India Company until well into the 19th century. So the economic effect on India, the nation, was not great. There was on the western side, yes. Yeah. The Sassoon family. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how much the Jardines traded on that side. They traded out of Calcutta, but yeah.
Jardine doesn't come out very well from this history.
Jardine and Matheson became. Matheson in particular became the second wealthiest landowner in England as a result of his profiteering from the opium trade. And Jardine became a member of the House of Commons, and Gladstone made very clear his dislike of Jardine in a novel he wrote, in which he described Jardine as a dreadful Mr. Druggy or something like that. Yeah.
There was a question here, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello there. Microphone just go.
Hello, my name is Prachi Sharma, and I am from the National University of Singapore. So, my reflection is this book is so coincidentally at a very opportune time when China has just came out with the rule on 1st Jan 2026 declaring silver as a strategic material, which makes it control 60 to 70% of trade, which it was already doing.
Yeah.
And I cannot help but reflect that it's like China is making silver like the porcelain of the history, that it has the control over silver.
I meant to mention that it's gone round in a circle, so that there was a huge silver demand during the 300-year period from the early 1500s to the early 1800s. Huge silver demand in China, and China now leads the world in the silver demand now through three reasons. I think electrification of almost everything, industrialization, and AI. And yes, they're locking up the silver market. Yeah.
So how do you think it will define the trade with China that will define our future and the geopolitical scenario?
Well, that is hard. I was speaking to Mr. Hinrich about this earlier. It looks very much as if the era of a rules-based world trade is well and truly behind us. The WTO has not been effective for a long time, partly because the Americans didn't like its results and sabotaged it, so it couldn't work. They sabotaged it by refusing to appoint members to the appeal process so that no one could appeal from a decision. So we are going to have an era, it looks, of protectionism, self-interest, and weaponization of trade. And in that sort of world, the strong dominate.
Thank you. Barrett.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, this is Barrett Bingley from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. We're based here in Singapore. Our headquarters is in Vancouver. Thank you for drawing the linkages to the modern day. I've got a couple of questions for you, but they're quite different, I think. First, I think we might have some budding authors in the room, and I wonder if you could talk about your research process. Some of the primary sources that you went to that you found interesting. How do you choose secondary sources, that sort of thing? Would be great to hear. And second, I wanted to look at when you reviewed all the kind of conflicts in the 1800s. What you didn't mention at all, and I was a bit surprised, was the Taiping Rebellion, because the Taiping rebels banned opium, gambling, alcohol, basically everything fun. Because
they banned sex.
I mean, I guess if you're the Chinese brother of Jesus, you might have some funny ideas, right? 30 million people died in that conflict, and the Western powers got involved to support the Qing dynasty to protect their treaty ports on that. So, or do you see that as kind of peripheral to the narrative that you're talking about?
Well, the narrative I was trying to explain was the Western invasions. Yes, the Taiping Rebellion added to the instability, but it wasn't the reason for the first Opium War. It hadn't happened by then, and it wasn't the reason for the second Opium War. It just added to the complication and mess that China was in, and the instability. And yes, Europeans engaged on both sides in the Taiping Rebellion. There were lots of mercenaries, lots of American and European mercenaries, and they were engaged in the arms trade, some to help the Taipings and some to help the then government. So it's a factor in the overall history of China, but I was focusing on the connection with the West.
The writing process, because we talked a little bit about this yesterday. My question to you was, when you started out with a sort of idea in mind about what the book would be, and how is that different to the final product? But going back to Barrett's point there around the sources and how the sort of operationalization of writing a book.
Well, I've had the same process for the last 4 books. The last 3, one was on Korea, one was on the United States leadership since World War II, which I got the idea from at Princeton in the first year of the first Trump presidency. And this was the third. What I tend to do is spend, with a big book, and this is a big one, spend a couple of years reading and thinking. And the more you read, the more you uncover, the more, and you drill down into the notes all the time, and then you get hold of the notes or the sources referred to in the notes, and so your knowledge spreads wider and wider, and you keep picking up new ideas, but new sources. Now, I'm very lucky to have a wonderful research assistant, two actually, but primarily one, who has access to all of the libraries in the world through her credentials. And everything's digitized these days. I needed books and sources for my book on Korea, which came from the Library of Congress in digital form. So, I start to find things, and I tell her what I need and what I want, and she'll get them for me. It could come from anywhere in the world, and then they often lead to more questions and more requests and more sources. So it develops. It's a huge organic process, and all the time during that reading process, your mind is thinking about a structure and what will work and what won't, and what points matter most, and it's an ongoing fluid process. And then you start to write after a few years of research, and when you start to write, you find that the process of research continues, because you write something and then you drill down a bit, and then you realize, well, I need to go a bit further on that, and you haven't been there before. So you're writing and reading and researching all at the same time. But the first couple of years, which is where I'm at with the next project, is sort of more relaxed, because there's no pressure to write anything. You're just learning and researching.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Hiro Ishizaka. I cover business development and geoeconomics for Mitsubishi Corporation here in Singapore. I think, with the recent developments in geopolitics, history is becoming much more important, especially pre the 20th century. And my question is that from a Chinese leadership point of view, what are the lessons, you already touched on it, what are the specific lessons that they took from the history, that you mentioned between China and the West in terms of trade, and how has that translated or affected, let's say, current strategies or policies, for example, the 9-dash map in the South China Sea, or maybe future policies moving forward? Thank you.
The lessons, I think, are these. China, because of its huge population, must have strong central government. That was the principle established by the first Qin emperor. He was the first one to create a unified China. And cardinal to that process was having strong central government, and, by the way, a meritocratic bureaucracy. Very, very clever minds. And that's what China has now. Strong central government, brilliant minds advising the government. The other thing, the other principle is this. China wants self-reliance. It's learnt that it can't depend on the West. I think to some extent it's given up. It's given up on the UK. I don't think it trusts the United States. So it above all else, it wants to be able to rely upon itself. And that's the way it seems to be going. But I must finish on the 9-dash line. Sorry to Andy. That's a military idea. I mean, China is surrounded on the East Coast by hundreds, I think, US bases, from Okinawa to Guam to Singapore to Australia, many of them, many more than I've mentioned. And that's not comfortable. So minds will differ on this, but the Chinese military has been built up in order to ensure its self-defense. Imagine if the United States had Chinese bases all around the Florida coast and up to North Carolina and so on. So that's what I think about the 9-dash line. You know, it's
just to pick up on the comment there about self-reliance, and that's very much underpins a lot of national strategy, and we see this in the 2025 policy and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
However, they also want access to overseas markets. Isn't that mercantilism?
Yes, and I don't think mercantilism is necessarily has a negative connotation. It's and I see more of China's trade happening with Asia and Africa and the many countries of South America than it will happen in the future with the United States. I almost said North America, but Canada has decided to be friendly again with China, and Europe. I don't know what will happen with the European trade. I did notice the other day, in the context of recent events, a European journalist, talk about the trade between the European Union countries and the United States being the biggest in the world. It's not. The biggest trade in the world is between China and the ASEAN nations. So I do think that some of us tend to look at the China position with a certain Western-centric bias still. And I think that is quite apparent at the moment.
One final one from me. This really struck me when I read this. Again, we mentioned this yesterday. This is a quote from Grant Wolseley, who was a young officer in the British Army, and he was at the sack of the Summer Palace in Beijing. And don't just think of a palace as a building. It's a massive site, huge grounds containing cultural treasures from centuries before, and so on. It was comprehensively razed to the ground. He was looking at this and then writing, as you have here in the book, his memoirs. 43 years later, he became the commander-in-chief of the British Army. There is no nation numerically as great as China. To me, they are the most remarkable race on earth, and I've always thought that and still believe them to be the great coming rulers of the world. They only want a Chinese Peter the Great or Napoleon to make them so. And in my idle speculation upon the world's future, I've long selected them as the combatants on one side of a great battle of Armageddon, the people of the United States of America being their opponents. It's 1903 or 4 or so when he was writing this. Is that inevitable?
First of all, the old Summer Palace was 860 acres. It was gigantic, and nothing was left. And the Chinese have left it in ruins as a testament to history. That's a very attractive passage. Is the reason I put it in, but I don't agree with General Wolseley. I think he became a field marshal. Yes, I can accept that, and I don't believe in the Thucydides trap argument either. I think China is too clever, too intelligent, too thoughtful to allow itself to be drawn into that sort of thing. I think there'll be a lot of provocation, and the sort of certain forces are doing their utmost in Taiwan to persuade the government to declare independence. Japan is going to be troublesome, but I think the last thing that China wants or aims for is military conflict on a large scale. There hasn't been a war involving China since effectively a border skirmish in February 1979 with North Vietnam. And that was instigated in part because United States had, in January of that year, established relations with China for the first time. And China supported Cambodia. I think Russia supported North Vietnam. And it is believed that China engaged in that 2.5-week-long war in order to establish its credentials with Washington. But that's all it did. So there was no war before that, no war except the Korean War. So we go from 1950 to the present without China engaging in a serious war with any country. So I don't see that pattern changing. They will make noises. You have to make noises to make it clear that you're not a pushover. And no doubt the generals, want to go to war, or some do, but China's not inclined to do that, I think, and I don't believe that there will be some sort of Armageddon.
Nice positive note on which to end the session. So many more questions and areas that I'd love to explore, but we are at time, unfortunately. It just remains for me to say this is the first time in front of a judge. Just for the record, and so I'm pleased and delighted at how well it's gone. But Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure, and I would urge everybody, students, people writing books, whoever you might be, to read this book, to think about the history, link that into today and tomorrow. So please join me in thanking Michael for his time today. Thank you.